May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be wholly acceptable to thee, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This weekend we celebrate Memorial Day. We honor all of the fallen soldiers who have fought and died for our country. Out of all of our federal holidays, it is second only to Christmas for its Christian character. I would like to briefly retell the story of the first Memorial Day, and I will explain why in a few moments. The first Memorial Day, we now know, was celebrated in 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places. In Charleston, there was an old racetrack that was converted into a prison for captured Union soldiers. The conditions were poor, and 257 soldiers died of disease and starvation. After death, they were tossed into a mass grave and covered over with a thin layer of dirt. With the war over and the Union firmly in control of the city by April of 1865, hundreds of black men came to the racetrack and began digging up the fallen soldiers. They were digging up soldiers black and white to give them a proper burial. Each of the fallen received a coffin and his own grave. The mass grave had turned into a respectable cemetery. But the clergy felt that it wasn't quite enough. They decided to have a full celebration for these soldiers. On Monday, May 3rd, 1865, more than 10,000 people processed into the Washington Racecourse Cemetery. Most were former slaves. When they arrived, they gathered around the graves and they read psalms, prayed, preached sermons, and sang hymns and other patriotic songs. 2,800 school children processed with flowers and decorated the graves along the way. This was so joyfully and thoroughly done that a reporter noted the graves at the close of the procession had the appearance of a mass of roses. The mass grave was transformed into a mass of roses amidst singing and prayer. It must have been a beautiful sight. At the end of the ceremony, the people proudly watched as the Massachusetts 54th, the 1st Regiment of Massachusetts to contain black soldiers, marched around the cemetery. After the ceremony, everyone stayed for a picnic, eating, drinking, and enjoying their freedom. That story may be familiar to you. Perhaps you've always known it, or perhaps you remember me telling it, as I do every 3 or 4 years. There is a reason why I thought it particularly important to retell this year. Tomorrow is Memorial Day, and it is also, though, the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, the worst pogrom in United States history. A mob of white, some even deputized by law enforcement and given weapons, attacked the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood often was called at the time the Negro Wall Street. It was the wealthiest black neighborhood in the country. The massacre was also the first to take place with air support, as private plane owners threw turpentine bombs on houses below. The riot and bombing destroyed 35 city blocks of the neighborhood. Up to 300 citizens were killed, 800 wounded, nearly 10,000 left homeless. Though many of the homes were insured, no policies were paid out. This all started because a group of white men overreacted to an interaction between a white woman and a black man. The 19-year-old black American was a shoe shiner by the name of Dick Rowland. He was well liked both by his fellow black Americans and his well-heeled white clientele, who later defended him. Rowland worked outside, but he had received permission from his employer to use a segregated bathroom at the top floor of a nearby building. This required that he use an elevator to get there. Elevators were segregated in larger buildings, but this building only had one elevator. The elevator operator was a young white woman by the name of Sarah Page. One day, Page gave out a screech as Rowland exited the elevator. A nearby employee heard it and came to investigate. Upon seeing Rowland exiting the building, he called the police. Page did not seem overly upset, so the police did not go searching for Rowland. They questioned Page, who said that Rowland had tripped and grabbed her arm to catch himself, which startled her. She said that she was not assaulted and would not press charges. The next day, Rowland was arrested anyway. It is not clear why. He was put in a neighborhood jail, but when the deputy's office received an anonymous threat to Rowland, he was transferred to the main police station and jail in Tulsa. That afternoon, a local paper reported that Rowland was in jail, and that there may also have been an editorial that openly wondered if there would be a lynching that night. Unfortunately, irresponsible punditry was not invented in the 21st century. That evening, hundreds of white people gathered at the jail and demanded that Rowland be given to them. The sheriff refused and placed armed men in strategic locations to defend the building from a possible riot. Hundreds more arrived, and the local black community feared that Rowland would be lynched. A group of black men armed themselves and were determined to protect Rowland and the sheriff. The sheriff pleaded with them to go home. Eventually, they went home. But during that time, some of the white mob went home to retrieve guns. When the Greenwood community heard that the mob was armed and growing in size, a group of armed black men, many of whom had served in the First World War, arrived at the scene. As often happens, no one is quite sure who fired the first shot. There are some accounts that claim that the first shot was a warning shot, which was misinterpreted. Whatever happened, an armed skirmish occurred in front of the jail. The black men eventually returned to Greenwood. There were rumors in the white community of a race riot, and hundreds of armed men attacked the Greenwood community. They threw Molotov cocktails, used makeshift bombs thrown from airplanes, and obtained a couple of machine guns decommissioned from the war. The black community did not go peacefully. There were gunfights throughout that night. And the white community's armed men knocked on the doors of whites who employed black servants. They demanded that these mostly black women be turned over to them and put into camps. Most complied. The National Guard started to assemble during the night, but only protected a few of the white neighborhoods until they received permission to suppress the riot. The permission did not come until almost noon. By that time, the Greenwood neighborhood was destroyed, and most likely, hundreds of black Americans were killed. I did not read about this in my history classes in high school. When I encountered the story for the first time, I was in college when the report was that only 26 black people had died, as that was still the record, which was the official count in 1921. This number was questioned immediately, but the incident was very quickly covered up. It took until 2001 for a more thorough reckoning of events to take place. And yet black Americans living in Greenwood in the 21st century were largely unaware of the worst race massacre in U.S. history. It only became part of their history curriculum in 2020. The first Memorial Day was a response to men being hastily buried in shallow graves by people who mistreated them in life and hated them in death. The only decent thing seemed to be to give those men a proper burial. This same effort is going on now in 2021 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Investigators are searching for unmarked and perhaps mass graves from the era. They have already found a few. It is the city's plan to give these men and women a proper burial. It is my hope that they receive it. Some of these men fought to protect their homes and the homes and lives of French citizens, just to have their own homes and lives taken by their fellow Americans. These stories are sad, but they must be told and remembered. On Memorial Day, it is important to remember that there is a cost to the wars that we fight. We must also account for the cost in lives that racism demands. Some of this work may be hard, but Paul encourages us, writing to the Romans, "You did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him." In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.